Welcome, everybody. I'm so glad you're here. John and I are co-hosting this session, and we're going to introduce ourselves here real quick. I think he just threw the slides up in the chat. If it's easier for you to look at those on your own, we are going to be sharing our screens and going through those, or if you just want to reference them later, go ahead and click on that link. Here we go. Hold on, I'm going to share here. And this is just a little disclaimer, guys. I am new to using Zoom. I was a Google Meets person up until like a week or two ago, so I'm figuring out the bugs, so just be patient with me. Go. And share my screen here. And see. I was just there. Okay. Here we go. Welcome, everyone. My name is Lindsay Pratt. I am new to the ESD as of a few weeks ago. I am an MTSS coach, working with Brian Bain and Ramel Ramos and some other folks. And I am really excited to be here. I also have with me John Potter from Oregon RTI. Both of us came from Tigard Tualatin School District. We've been there for quite a long time, both of us. And we just moved over to the ESD this year, both programs. So John, you want to?
Yeah, welcome everyone. Nice to see everyone's faces this morning. So yeah, I'm John Potter, new to Northwest Regional ESD. So I'm one of the coaches with the Oregon Response to Instruction and Intervention Project. Some of you may be familiar with it, many of you may not, but we have worked for the past, I think, 16, 17 years. It's basically the statewide support for multi-tiered systems around reading instruction. So we've had the opportunity to work with a little bit over 100 school districts across the state of Oregon. Some of the school districts that you are probably work with as well, a number in the region we have worked with in the past, and just have learned a lot about how to make multi-tiered systems work well for folks. So glad to be here and always appreciate the opportunity to talk about this work.
And my background is as a school psychologist and a PBIS coach in our district. I'm a huge advocate for mental health and students with special needs and making sure our schools are supportive of all of our students. So we're going to start talking today about MTSS and how it supports that work. Just a few things before we get started. If you can stay muted unless you're in a breakout room, we've got a big group today, so that kind of helps everybody here. If you have a question, go ahead and throw it in the chat. If it makes sense to answer it right then, we will. Or if it doesn't quite fit into what we're talking about at that moment, we'll just save it till the end and then we'll hit all of those. If you like having your video on, that's great. I really like seeing human faces when I'm talking. But if you don't feel comfortable, that's totally fine too. Do what you need to do. And we will be recording the main room, but I think you're only on camera if you are unmuted. So if that's an issue for you, just keep your mute on. Okay, here we go. Okay, so in the chat, because we've got a big group here, please share the following. Your name and what you do here at the ESD. And share one thing that you did this summer, and this could be just a phrase or even one word that made you feel peaceful, rested, energized, ready to come back. Go ahead. Nice. Wakeboarding, road tripping. Swing dancing. Having an assistant principal. Oh. Lots of time with loved ones. Me too. And a relay. Nice. Horticultural project. Oh, cool. Sees COVID. Nice. Killers. I'm in Maui. Beautiful. Okay. Thanks, everybody. I appreciate that. It's nice that we all have things that we can get out of here and get ready to come back and feel ready to serve our kids, because it takes all of us to do this work. Here we go. Going back. Okay. So what is MTSS? We're going to talk about that a little bit today. And I'm going to start us off here. So MTSS, multi-tiered systems of support, actually came out of the healthcare model in the United States. It was that concept that, if you can see this well, this out of the way, so I can see it, that we needed to do a lot of prevention to prevent people from having more costly and damaging health problems, right? So things like putting fluoride in our water, everyone wearing seat belts, getting regular checkups, eating healthy food, that kind of stuff all makes it so that you are less likely to have health problems over time. And those are the things we advocate for. Those are the things we teach people to do, right? And the idea is that if you're doing that really well, most people should have a minimum number of problems. That's the theory. They're all getting healthcare, all that stuff. Even in that kind of a system where we're doing all of that prevention, it still makes sense that some people are going to need more. Some people are going to have more unique health needs. They're going to have high blood pressure. They're going to get cavities, things like that. And they're going to need a little bit more support. They're going to need a little bit more medication or a little bit more medical care. And even with having really clear supports in both of those levels, there's going to be some people that are going to need a very high level of healthcare over the course of their lives, right? Things like cancer treatment, organ transplants, those really intensive things that only a few people need proportionally out of the total, but are really impactful for their lives. The idea is that if you're doing all this stuff underneath, you're going to have fewer and fewer people that need those things right at the top. So if you can organize your work in a way that you put the most effort into the bottom tier, you're going to have fewer and fewer people that need that top tier. So that's the concept. And this is what MTSS came out of. Oop. And why isn't it letting me forward? John, help me out here. I'm hitting my forward button and I'm not moving.
Should just be able to click on the slide.
Oh, thank you.
There you go.
Okay, trying to hit my arrows. This is not Google Meets, guys. This is different. Okay, so we have, this is probably the first thing you've seen in here. Throw it in the chat if this looks familiar. Most people have seen this triangle before if you've worked in any schools in our region. So that whole concept of tier 1, universal supports, here's stuff we do for everybody. Tier 2, 5 to 15% of students are going to need that, which means kind of an organized, just basic structure, something that's already sort of pre-created. And then 1 to 5% of our kids, if we're doing those first 2 tiers well, are going to need a really individualized level of support. This is a framework. So that's kind of a visual of that framework. This is one I actually like a lot more, because what this highlights to me is that you can apply this thinking to almost any initiative that you have. So you can apply this to social emotional learning. You can apply this to mental health, to academics. It obviously applies to behavior. And you have these 3 levels of support here, but you can see how they build on each other in this visual. So everybody's getting that green zone, right? The people at the yellow zone are getting that green plus the yellow, and the people at the red are getting all 3 tiers. So you can see kind of how they stack, because that's a really important concept, right? We don't just move kids from tier to tier, we add a layer, we add extra support. Okay, so we're going to talk about tier 1, right? This is the thing that we do for everybody. And no matter what your initiative, there's a few things that you want to have. So we want to think about providing to every single student, that it should be sufficient for most of our students. And when I say most of our students, I mean considering across all of your groups, all of your racial groups, people with disabilities. This should work for most of your people across demographic groups, and it should be harmful to no one. Okay, so a few critical features of this: evidence-based core instruction. So we really want to make sure the things that we're using are evidence-based, that they are matched to our kids. And by that, I mean our specific population, who goes to your school, what are those needs? Not only what are the skill needs that they have, but what is the demographic of your building, and is the curriculum and the instruction that you're choosing matched well to that demographic group. And we should also be ensuring that we're delivering that with fidelity. So we know that everybody got it. We feel confident in that. We want to gather screening data from all students to see if it's working. And we want to have a series of meetings to review that core and check to see if it's working for most students across those groups. And I put this in here because this will vary a little bit, but at least 2 to 3 times a year, these meetings should occur for academics or SEL screeners, and monthly for behavior screening, because behavior can change a little more quickly. A really critical feature of Tier 1 is that if 20% of students across, more than 20% need additional support, that is an indication that your Tier 1 is not effective. You need to go back to your Tier 1 and revamp. It is impossible to serve more than 20% of your kids at a Tier 2 level. It's just impossible. You won't have the bandwidth in your building. And more than that, it really is a red flag for you that something is off about the core. It is much more efficient to go back and do that work in the core than try to serve a ton of kids at that higher level. It doesn't work that way. Okay, so when you get into those Tier 1 meetings, what is the purpose? So we want to identify our patterns and trends. We're looking at the overall effectiveness of the school, of the specific program we're looking at, and we want to make sure our system is equitable. We want to make sure we're looking at who are these systems working for and who are they not working for, and what do we need to change here. Okay. So we are going to send you into some breakout rooms to answer these questions. Where do those kind of Tier 1 discussions happen in your work, in your specific environment? So, and that's the question, how are things going for all? How are things going in general? Where do you have those kinds of discussions in your work? If you do have a meeting like that or a structure like that, what's the focus or the goal, the topic of the meeting, and what data do you use? What are you considering? And if you don't, if you did do something like that, what data would be most relevant in your setting? Okay, so John, you want to send people into breakout rooms?
Yep, I'm going to
We're going to give you about 10 minutes.
Yep, I'll go ahead and launch those right now.
Thank you. John, you want me to set a timer? You got it.
I can look at the timer. I'll set one.
Okay. Do you want me to stop sharing my screen and we can swap you in?
Yeah, if you stop sharing, I'll pop up mine.
Oh, wait, pause share. More. Do I just, is pause share the correct, or is there a stop sharing?
You should be able to just stop share.
Okay. Okay, I'm gonna hit pause share, but that seems to leave my screen up.
I could probably just share
Oh,
over
stop
it.
share. Got it. Okay. I think I got it. Nope, I don't. Oh, wait. Stop
Here.
share. There we go.
There you go.
Oh, Zoom is testing me.
Yeah, it's a learning curve.
Yeah.
There we go. All right, so I think we have everyone back now. So maybe we start just by, if people want to put in the chat kind of, these are the questions again, within your tier one work, if you have that going on, you're having that meeting structure, those conversations, what is the goal or focus of those meetings? What data do you use? And if not, what data might be relevant for your students? So if people just want to kind of talk about, throw in the chat something that came up at your breakout room, what tier one looks like in your context. Just starting MTSS. Using reading data to adjust and intensify instruction. Need some better understanding what's the difference between tier one and tier two. We'll talk a little bit about that. Classroom meetings with general ed and special ed teams together. Awesome. Yeah. Yeah, Scott, that's a good point. Students in higher level needs classes at tier three still have access to all tier one supports. Yeah, that's a big point Lindsay talked about, that the tiers stack on top of each other. They're additive. We don't replace. So how to apply MTSS to do roles. Okay. So keep throwing things in there as we kind of talk, but we're going to kind of move on a little bit to talk about tier two. And so a key piece, again, Scott kind of mentioned this in the chat there, but they are additive. We add on top tier two supports. We don't replace tier one when we add tier two or tier three supports, because part of that becomes an equity and access issue. Tier one is grade level supports. Tier one is high standards. Tier one is what we want all students to get. And when we start replacing that, we start teaching down to a lower level, and we withhold access to those powerful grade level and beyond higher level content to our students. So we want to have additional supports. Another key feature, when you look at that triangle, I want to kind of make this distinction. We think about the triangle and we think about kids as they fit in the triangle. And unfortunately, we fall into the inappropriate use of language, saying things like, oh, that's a tier one kid, or that's a tier two kid, and this is a tier three kid. And so multi-tiered systems in RTI, those tiers of support are were never meant to be about the kids. Like, you don't have any tier one kids, tier two kids, you don't have red kids, yellow kids. That's not what this is about. But the tiers describe the levels of support that we provide. It's not about the kids, it's about what we're able to provide for students. So tier one is for all students, tier two is what we're going to provide for some students that are going to need a little bit more support. And so what do we mean by tier two? So we often, the most typical way that we talk about that is interventions. And sometimes if you hear us present in the future, we talk about tier two is more standardized interventions, whereas tier three is more customized interventions. And so at tier two, what we're really trying to do is layer on top some really good evidence-based interventions that we know are going to be effective with a lot of your kids with extra needs. Not all your kids with extra needs. There are no kids or no programs that are going to meet the needs of all your kids. If anyone tries to sell your program, says this is going to be good for all your kids, unless it's a tier one program, that's just not the case. Tier two is meant to target some specific skills. So they're ready to go for most common needs. So we think about, efficiency. We don't want to have to individualize for every kid that needs a little bit more. One, because it's inefficient, and two, because it's ineffective. We just don't have the time to do that. I've worked in systems where we try to individualize for each and every kid, and you just can't get around to every kid the way that we want to. So we have some good tier two programs, whether those be reading interventions that target a specific need, such as phonics, fluency, phonemic awareness, whether that be a behavior intervention that targets a specific function of behavior, We've got good SEL programs. We've got good math interventions. The level of math intervention is growing in availability. So we've got some good programs. They're going to work with a lot of your kids. We want to make sure that we're matching those to the specific needs of those kids. As Lindsay said, these are available to about 20% of your kids, maybe a little bit less, maybe a little bit more. But if you're providing more, if you have more than 20% of your kids that are needing interventions, that's a tier 1 issue. And that's a specific, that point is very salient right now, because coming out of the last 2.5 years of instruction that kids have received, you're going to have a lot of kids that look like they need interventions because they've had a pretty significant disruption in their instruction. But rather than try and provide interventions for all those kids, what we want to go back to and think about is how do we beef up our core instruction to make sure that all of our students are getting what they need through that, while also still providing some additional intervention support for kids that need a little bit more. And so within that tier 2, then we want to use data to drive some discussions about what we do with those interventions and make sure they're effective. And so there's a few different discussions that we have at tier 2. First, we're going to use our screening data to find and identify students who are not responding to the core that are going to need a little bit extra. And it's really important that we use the screening data and other data sources maybe to do that, rather than just relying on teacher referral. And we'll talk about this later in the presentation, but teacher referral is inequitable. It also depends on the skill level of the teacher, the preference of the teacher. I've definitely been in schools where they've just let every teacher say, all right, you get 2 kids that you get to refer from every classroom. Well, if one teacher has more needy kids, that doesn't really seem fair. So we want to have some data that drives who's going to get those tier 2 additional interventions. And we want to be really transparent about that. It shouldn't be hidden how a kid gets an intervention. It should be very clear to both our staff as well as our families and communities that this is, when we see this level of skill or this level of need, this is how we're going to respond to it. We also have meetings to talk about if the interventions are working as a whole. Are most of our students effective? Interventions are supposed to work for many or most of your kids that are receiving them. And so when we have these meetings, we start out by looking at intervention groups to say, do we have groups of kids, that are making progress, or is it really some individual kids that need some additional support? Rather than going kid by kid by kid by kid, we do that, we can get into this forest from the trees kind of idea that we miss that there's a systemic problem when we say, oh, but this kid is not making progress, this kid's not making progress, what are we going to do for him? Versus saying most of our kids in intervention are not making progress. That's an intervention issue. That's not a kid issue. That's what can we do to fix our intervention support. So we want to have discussions about groups of kids and interventions rather than always going kid by kid by kid. But we do want to have some conversations about individual student progress to say, who are the kids that are really struggling the most, not making the most progress, and kids that we really need to follow up with some additional support, maybe some tier 3 level support, or just changing our tier 2 supports. So we want to have those conversations as well. So tier 2, kind of what does that look like? I kind of touched on this, but you really want to have clearly defined entrance as well as exit criteria, right? Interventions are supposed to work. Tier 2 is not, it shouldn't be a life sentence. Kids should not live in tier 2 for their entire academic career. Some kids may need that level of support for a while, but many kids should be able to get that extra shot of tier 2 supports or instruction and be able to, fade that away over time. So we want to have some decision rules that are clear, developed by a number of different partners within your school, but also, communicated clearly to everyone so we know how kids get in and out of intervention. We also want to make sure that we have explicit instruction, increased opportunities to practice. Kids who need interventions typically need more. For example, in reading, kids who struggle with reading don't necessarily need something drastically different than other kids who aren't struggling. What they need is more. They need more opportunities to respond, more explicit instruction, more feedback, more time, smaller group size, all those things. So we want to make sure that we're being more explicit with kids that need that. And we want to gradually release that as well. Again, we shouldn't have that level of explicitness over time for all kids. We want to make sure to draw that back over time. So hopefully we're seeing progress with kids. And then we also want to increase communication with families. Families shouldn't have to wait until their student is brought up for an IEP to know that their kid was struggling. When kids need an additional intervention, parents should know about that. For a number of reasons. One, because their kid's going to be getting some additional supports that they can help support at home as well. But also what we've typically done in education is when kids get more, In the past, really the only more was special education. We didn't really have other interventions or places for kids to go to get additional support. So there's a lot of families and community members out there that when they hear kids are getting more, that starts to set up some red flags. Oh, does my student have a disability? And that's not the case. You know, at this point, we're just providing some additional tier 2 supports. We want to make sure families have a clear understanding of what we're providing and what that's going to be so they can support that as well. And so we collect progress monitoring data all along the way as we're doing this. So we're checking in more frequently than those 3 times a year screening. So we want to know basically with that progress monitoring data, we want to know, is the intervention effective? You know, is it working? Are they growing over time? Or is the intervention insufficient? You know, do we need to intensify in some way? Or are we seeing a kid that's flatlining in some capacity? So we want to make sure that we're collecting some regular data, and we have some data systems here at Northwest Regional. I know ION is one that's used pretty frequently that can look at this data in a pretty sophisticated way, so we can make sure that we're growing kids the way that they need to be. So just look at the chat right now. Yes, Tina, your comment, friend who found out her son was in tier 2 for several weeks before she found out. Yeah, I mean, they should know right away because tier 2 is not a bad thing. You know, it's not something that we should stigmatize. Some kids need extra support. All of us in our lives need extra support with something. You know, everyone needs extra support with something. So there's nothing wrong with that. So we want to make sure parents are aware of that so they can help support that and understand what their students are getting. So that is kind of your crash course on tier 2. So I will say too, you know, these are very quick kind of snapshots of tier 1 and tier 2 and tier 3. There are additional sessions after this one by some of my Oregon RTI colleagues that will go into more depth. So if you have some questions around tier 1 or tier 2, what that looks like, attend those sessions. I'll also say, you know, even if you attend all these sessions, you know, that's what, 3-4.5 hours of RTI MTSS training. It's not going to be enough to just go and do it. Like this takes, you know, months, years of time with a team to really get this going. So this is more just for you to kind of get an idea of what this is and kind of pique your interest on where you need to focus some of your time as you support the schools that you work with. So we're going to send you back to breakout rooms. So again, same question. So where do tier 2 discussions happen? Do you have tier 2 data meetings? If not, what data would be most relevant for you? And I'll make sure to put those questions in the chat after we send you to breakout rooms, so you will have those. So let me go ahead.
Okay, I can do that right now.
Okay, yeah, go ahead,
go.
launch it.
I see Brian's got the questions in the chat. Thank you, Brian.
I did that. One of the things we discovered is if you do it before you send them to breakout, they'll stay in their chat.
Oh, good.
So they can discuss them. And that's why people are asking for them. That's why I hung back to tell you that too.
Thank you. Appreciate
Yeah,
that.
the facilitation thing that I totally forgot about.
Okay, you want to swap me back?
Yeah, you should be able to share.
Okay. Oops. I'll go back. Oh, wait. No. I'm struggling with how to go back. There we go. See, sometimes my front arrows and back arrows work and sometimes they don't.
Yeah, you gotta make sure you're on the slideshow and not on like the Zoom controls when you're
I
going back
see,
and forth.
okay. That's
Yeah,
fine.
it's easy to mix up.
Or do you have a, sorry, did you have a timer going, John? I forgot to do that.
I do, yeah.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, are we all back, John?
Looks like, yeah.
Okay. So if people would like to throw in the chat, just something that came out of your breakout room, if you have something like this, what does that look like in your building? A line about that. Or if you don't, do you have some ideas in mind about how it could look? Or if at some point, if you had those kinds of structures, what would be most relevant for you to consider? Go ahead and throw those ideas into the chat.
I have a question while people are kind of throwing stuff into the chat.
Yeah.
We kind of talked about, how do you determine when it's time to fade back a support? And is it like a check-in, check-out? They're doing well 90% of the time? Do you just do a different check-in? Do you fade it out completely? Do it once a week? How do you determine when the student needs to be, those supports need to be faded out?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good question. I think it kind of depends on what intervention you're talking about, and what skill you're building. But to follow your example of check and check out, there are actually check and check out decision rules that they are just guidelines. Again, you got to sort of bring your own wisdom to it, but they would say after a kid has been making consistently 80% for about 4 to 6 weeks, I think is the general guideline, you should think about starting to wean them back. So sometimes that might mean having fewer check-in points during the day. Sometimes that might mean maybe they go for just seeing the check-in or check-out person once a week, something like that. So it kind of depends on the kid. How do you start to fade that support over time? Okay. So going back over here to the chat, I'm seeing happening student services teams, depending on the intervention. Yep. Behavioral data, it can be more subjective. Absolutely. You want to be really concrete when you're thinking about what you're rating for behavior. This is IT process, map testing, shifting the pyramid, yeah. European or school site. How data is tracked and utilized to determine next steps. Yep. And data. Somebody in the chat earlier, I think it was Leanne, posted something to the effect of every child is a pyramid. It was a quote that she'd heard from somebody once. And I just wanted to reference that because we sort of skipped over it at the time because there was a lot being said, but I think that is so true. I think every human is a pyramid. We are all pyramids, and I've certainly got things for me that I'm in the green zone for. I can, do those things with relatively little help. I feel really confident in them. I'm real good at answering emails. I can cook pretty well. But when it comes to other things like having a consistent workout routine, I am in the red zone. I need somebody to come and help me with that and move me out of my routine and help me stick to something. So we're all kind of all over that map, depending on what we're talking about. So I think it's helpful to normalize that for our kids and our families and our staff.
Yeah, and I would just add, we get this question, we ask this question a lot, and it's very telling the answer. When we talk about the triangle and kids with disabilities, we ask, well, where does specially designed instruction occur in the triangle? And some people say, well, it's in that top, that red zone. It's everywhere. It's in the green, it's in the yellow, it's in the red. Like, you should have specially designed instruction supports across the continuum for kids with disabilities because they vary in content areas. Some may be getting reading support, but not math support. But even if they've got a reading IEP, they should be getting supports within the tier 1 as well as tier 2 and tier 3. So it occurs throughout all of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So we did that. So let's talk about tier 3. So again, we're layering, right? We're getting all of that tier 1, that rich teaching for everybody. We're getting some yellow zone support, and then we're going into individualized for our tier 3 supports. So these are individually designed, right? So this is where we have done some tier 2 and we're not seeing the impact for the student that we want. And we're thinking we need to layer on something additional or troubleshoot that and individualize it a little bit more. This should be about 1 to 5% of your school. If it's over too much, if it's over 5%, that might be an indication that you've got something going on with that tier 1 and tier 2 portion that you want to re-examine. And if it's less than 1%, that can be an indication that we might be missing some kids. So that's something, maybe our screenings aren't as sensitive as we need them to be. So that's sort of the healthy range. Tier 3 is something we add to kids after we have done some individual analysis of them, right? So we don't have something automatic that we go, oh, if tier 2 is not working, we go straight to this. That's not how it works. We take a really individual look at that kid. So that might mean something like individual problem solving, doing some deep dives into that kid's history of schooling, doing some empathy interviews with that kid and their family. That could include developmental history information. If it's a behavioral thing, that might include a functional behavior assessment. There's lots of ways that we can sort of dig deeper and figure out what's going on. Sometimes observations can be helpful, watching, how a kid is learning, what's going on in that room when he's going for the intervention. So really important to gather some initial, some individual data here and try to take a deep dive for this student. 3 things you want to make sure that you're considering when we're looking at that tier 3 are the instruction. Is the instruction matched to this student well? Is this the right instruction? Is this the right curriculum? Do we need to change what we are teaching? And is the environment conducive to what the student needs? Maybe there's stuff going on there that isn't working for the student that we need to adjust. So we're constantly trying to figure out, how do we have a better fit between that student and what we are providing, right? How do we make it work? Sometimes people have questions about examples of, what does it mean to individualize a tier 3? What are the kinds of things you might do at this level? And this, I won't go super deep into this, but this is just a few examples to answer that question. So things that you might consider is checking the strength of the program. Sometimes there's programs that are not meant to serve kids that have a really a lower skill in that area. They're meant to serve that more yellow zone of skill level. So making sure that that program is designed well for students that have that level of need. Maybe like John mentioned earlier, we just need to increase the dosage of the program. Maybe that kid needs more opportunities to respond. They need a little more practice with this thing. So we can maybe make that group smaller or give them a one-on-one component during their day. Are we sure that the thing that we're teaching them is really aligned to the skill they need and not to things they've already mastered, right? Let's clean it up a little. Let's just really target it. Sometimes kids can perform a skill in the environment where we've taught it, but then we go back to the classroom and they can't perform it there, right? They can't generalize. So is that the problem? Is that they can do it here, but we can't see it when we move it back to the place? So how do we help them generalize that skill? Or is there another thing getting in the way, right? Is there, are they struggling to pay attention in that group? Is something about that distracting for them? Are they struggling with executive functioning skills that we could support while they're going through this intervention? So those are just a few things to consider at that tier 3 level. There's a lot of other ones too, but those are big ones. Okay, so where does tier 3, we're going to send you back in your breakout rooms. Where does that tier 3 problem solving happen in your setting? So when you're thinking about those kids that you serve that need the absolute most support, right? The highest level of support that you provide, where does the problem solving happen around those students? What data do you look at? And who brings it? And if you're not having meetings like that, how would that be relevant for your work? Where would those kids show up if you could design it? So John, would you mind getting that breakout room started for me?
Yep, send it right now.
We'll post the question into the chat.
Got that.
You got it. Thank you.
All right, here we go. And this one will be a little bit shorter, probably about 6 minutes or so.
Oh, Rachel. Okay.
Saw that too late.
Uh-oh.
Looks like she's on a side, so hopefully that doesn't send her.
Rachel, I'm so sorry that that's going on. I just saw your message in the chat.
All right, Lindsay, I can go ahead and share now if you want to put the screen down.
Okay, we are back.
All right. So anyone want to put your thoughts, something that came up in the chat? I think probably by the nature of the work that some of us in this room do, tier 3 supports is probably a little bit more familiar to folks. But if you want to put in there, what kind of tier 3 problem solving is happening? And if not, is there relevant data that you would want to be able to do that in your setting? Yeah, full firewall view. I'd also add to thinking about, how we layer services tier 1, 2, and 3. Tier 3 often contains an evidence-based program. So if you're giving like a reading level of tier 3 supports, you're still going to do that evidence-based reading intervention. You're just going to need to customize that in some way because delivering the standard package to the student, you probably already tried and that didn't work. So you need to layer on top of that. But yeah, need to review data regularly, consider implementation data. Yeah, data is going to be huge. As the level of need goes up, implementation data becomes even more important because these are pretty high stakes decisions that kids are receiving at level tier 3 level of support, as well as kids that may or may not be needing an IEP as well. Yeah, lots of kids on IEPs. Make sure you're providing supports for each one. It's challenging. Yeah. Tier 3 happening very frequently. Yeah. I think for this group of folks, probably this is right in your wheelhouse. Yeah, IFSPs, problem solver teachers. Yeah, and when we talk about tier 3 level support to an individual problem solving, we talk about the integration of your MTSS or your RTI system with special ed. Special ed is a part of that. As I said, within all tiers, you should have special ed included in those conversations. Special ed teachers should be at the table for your tier 1 discussions. You don't wait until a kid gets to a tier 3 level support before special ed gets involved. We want to have inclusive practices that really get all the voices at the table. Yeah, so clarify how tier 3 and IEPs relate. Yeah, that's a tricky one. I think the way that I think about it, if you have a student who's needing a level of tier 3 support, it means that they're getting tier 1 support, and then we've provided 1, maybe 2 tier 2 interventions. So we've gone through some of those standard packages that we have, and they haven't worked. And so tier 3 is that individual problem solving process that Lindsay referred to, where we really ramp up and look at individual needs of the student. At that point, it's really not an IEP yet. We're not moving directly to special education before we really individualize and take a deeper dive on what the individual student needs. It may lead to an IEP though. If we're looking at individual problem solving in tier 3 and go through that whole process, put in place this great matched intervention across the student's day and it still doesn't work, then you may want to start having some conversations about, is this a student with an IEP? And the team may decide to refer for evaluation at that point.
I would also say, depending on the situation and the kid, there's some times when we get kids to tier 3 and that is working for them, but the level of support they need to make that growth is so intensive. Some of those kids, we might be wondering at that point if they are a student with a disability and they might need those services guaranteed to them. And that would be another way that that students in tier 3 might make it to evaluation for an IEP.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so let's kind of move towards the last part of this. So we want to talk about this idea of teaming. We've talked about the teaming at tier 1, 2, and 3, but this is really important within a multi-tiered system. You want to have some sort of process, some cycle of inquiry to really go through the same process at each tier to talk about students. And so, within MTSS and RTI framework, we talk about a problem-solving process. This may seem similar to like a PDSA, a Plan, Do, Study, Act cycle, same kind of idea. But the language problem-solving process is typically used in a multi-tiered system. Now, it's important to know, though, when we talk about problem-solving process, those words are sometimes loaded. And so when we talk problem-solving, the intent of problem solving and the design of it was never intended to insinuate that we're solving problems that are inherent in children, that deficit mindset, that there's something wrong with the kid and we need to solve that kid because that kid is a problem. That is not what we're talking about with a problem solving process, right? So what we're talking about is problems are defined as a really a mismatch of our system and the support that we're providing for a student and what they need and how far away they are from being successful. And so whatever tier we're looking at, we're really looking at solving problems within our system. So we're not, one way to think of it is we're really not trying to change kids, we're trying to change adults. We're trying to change our practice so we can meet the needs of our students. That's what problem solving is. It's problem solving our system so we can support our kids better. So we think about the steps that we go through, and these may seem familiar, or if they're not, they seem similar to what you've already maybe know. But the first step is really identifying clearly what is our problem, and so using some data. Someone needs to be muted there. But really looking at what's the difference between where our students are at versus where we want them to be. So at tier 1, do we have 80% of kids on track, or is it 50%? How big is that gap between having most of our students successful versus not successful? And not just as a whole number there, but also looking at who are our tier 1 supports working for and who are they not working for. Lindsay talked about this. If you look at your core and you say, well, 80% of our kids are good, we're good, we don't need to make any changes. But then you dive a little deeper and say, well, it's actually working for 90% of our white kids. It's only working for about 50% of our students of color. That's a problem. Even though you got 80% of kids it's working for, that's not a core that's working. We want to dive a little bit deeper and disaggregate our data to look at who it's working for and who it's not working for. Tier 2, we're really starting to look at analyzing why is this the case. And this is really the bread and butter of a problem solving cycle. This is where we spend our time, is looking at data, evidence, collecting multiple pieces to really figure out why do we not have more kids on track? Why are we not serving our students of color as well as we should be? Why is this particular student at tier 3 blowing out every day? What's the function of that behavior? Where are they successful? What are their strengths? What are their needs? Kind of really digging deep within that, but using data to drive that process. And then we use that data to develop a plan. What are we going to do about that? And then we come back together after we've implemented, a cycle, whatever that may be. So you may run an intervention, say for 8 to 10 weeks, come back, talk about that. For tier 1, it may be from screening cycle to screening cycle. So behavior, that's going to be more frequently, maybe monthly. Reading, it's probably going to be, 3 months or so from fall to winter, winter to spring. But we want to have some way of looking at data to say our plan is working or it's not working, as well as did we implement the plan? That's one thing that we typically skip over is we come back together with the data. We say it worked or didn't work. We actually don't have any data to say that we actually did what we said we're going to do. So we want to make sure that we have some evidence to drive that. And all of this is driven by having some sort of decision rules. And we touched on this around tier 2, but you want to have decision rules across the continuum, because those really guide us to really think about how we want to serve our students and kind of take away some of the bias and subjectivity out of our decision making. So the way we think of decision rules is they really cause us to pause, analyze, and respond. They are not hard and fast like an automated algorithm where when this happens, we always do this no matter what. That's not the way that we think about it. But the way that I think communicates this clearly is think about a GPS, right? GPS we all use, or most of us probably use, to get where we need to go. But your GPS isn't perfect, right? And so, this is kind of the extreme example. And here the GPS said go down these stairs because it's an exit. Clearly that is not an exit. But just because it does this every once in a while, like this is funny because it doesn't happen frequently, right? This doesn't happen all the time. So I'm not going to stop using my GPS if it does this. Hopefully I'm going to pause, analyze, and respond when it tells me to go down the stairs. I'm going to say, well, that's not right. I'm going to go a different way. But I don't stop using my GPS. So I don't stop using decision rules just because they're not right 100% of the time, because decision rules are going to guide our thinking and make some more objectivity across our decision makers, because we have a wide range of people making decisions. We want to be consistent in our decision making. I'll talk about some of the reasons for that in some upcoming slides. But we want to think about, decision making is really one of the key features of a healthy multi-tiered system. And so how do we make better decisions within MTSS? Well, the first way is that we want to use high quality data and we want to use decision rules. And so I talk a lot about data. Data is important, but also high quality data. Data's become kind of a loose term in education. Everything's data. And there's some low quality data, to be honest. I don't have the slide in here today, but I use the slide a lot. I think about if I told you, I eat a lot of salad, you'd think I was pretty healthy, right? You think of the word salad, and what does that conjure up in your mind? This nice healthy green thing with greens, vegetables, cucumbers, tomatoes, nice dressing, something that's really delicious. But I spent a few years working in the Midwest, and they have a totally different idea of what salad is. They have things like Oreo salad, Snickers salad, basically just pure candy and whipped cream. Still called a salad, but not really nutritious. And so we want to think about our data in the same way. Just because you buy a test or from a publisher, it says this is database or this is data. Is that really high quality data that's valid, reliable, tested with the kids, the type of kids that you're working with? We want to make sure that we have high quality data guided by decision rules. We also want to make decisions as a team with diverse partners. We want to bring different minds around the table, different representation across special ed, general ed, parents, communities to make these decisions. Because as we're sitting at the table, I'm not really easily able to see the flaws in my own thinking, but everyone else around the table is. So rarely in a good MTSS are we making decisions on our own. It should be a team decision for a lot of the decisions that we're making. We also schedule time for decision making. That's going to be important. And sometimes we can't buy more time, we can't get more time, but can we use the time that we have better? So, can we have an agenda? Can we make sure that we're getting right into talking about what we need to talk about, not, getting off track with telling stories about kids that are irrelevant to what we're talking about? We want to make sure that we use time wisely. And we need to train and support staff how to collect and use data. This is a big one. We've also got a lot of teachers that have come to the teaching profession unprepared in their teaching, preparation programs to do things like teach reading in a science-based way, to manage behavior. Unfortunately, a lot of folks coming into the teaching profession don't get that. They also don't get a lot of training on how to use data. So we want to make sure that folks understand what are the appropriate uses of data, what's the inappropriate use of data, what is a high quality data source. We need to support teachers in understanding those things. So Lindsay's going to talk a little bit about benefits of an MTSS.
Yeah. So one of the hugest benefits, these are all three really big ones, but I would say this is an organized process that kind of helps you improve things over time. And the biggest benefit I feel like I've seen is that people feel calmer when they have a predictable structure, right? That is the first tenet of trauma-informed care, is to make sure that it is predictable and safe, right? And I think our teachers and counselors and other people that work with kids and support specialists feel a lot of pressure to have the right answer, to know which kids need what. And that's an overwhelming feeling. And in my experience, teachers and other staff that are working in buildings and settings where we have some team decision making, we have some decision rules, we look at data together and make decisions together, and it's in this really predictable way, people feel a lot better. It helps with morale, people feel calmer. I think it's huge. It makes a huge difference to your setting. You also have fewer students falling through the cracks. We're catching kids before they're failing, because we're constantly doing those screening measures, those short little dips, to make sure that we're catching kids before they're really starting to struggle and getting them that support. And we're also, this is kind of a byproduct of it, but you're way more likely to identify the kids that need special education referral correctly, as opposed to just sort of trusting our gut about that, which can lead to a lot of biased decision making. And John's going to talk about that.
Yeah, so we want to talk a little bit about biases, and MTSS is a good way to kind of reduce those biases and minimize them. You're not going to eliminate biases because that's just impossible. Like, we are, to be honest, human beings are walking bias machines. Like, we have our own baked in biases, our cognitive errors that we have, and that's just part of who we are. And so you think about all the different ways our thinking can go wrong. And this is just a list of some of them. And you can go back to this slide, this website that's listed down there. You can click on any of these. You can see what the bias is, how to avoid it, what some examples of it. But all these things are things that we are subject to as human beings. We have confirmation bias. We're more likely to believe in things that confirm what we already think. We see that a lot in social media, to be honest. Like, you agree with anything that you see posted without actually thinking about sometime, well, is that true? It's like, well, I agree with it, so it's got to be true, right? And anything I disagree with is not true. We have implicit biases. We have, in-group bias, this idea that we're biased against, members of our in-group. So if, we're white, we're biased for white kids and against kids of color. That's just part of the social order of what we've been conditioned to do. So we need to make sure that we're checking our biases and thinking about these in really important ways. And so some examples of that show up in education. Here's one that just is from a couple of months ago, actually. A study came out looking at 2 ways of identifying kids with dyslexia. And so they looked at, comparing an assessment, so DIBELS Next, which is now a cadence. So these brief measures of phonemic awareness, phonics, 1-minute measures, versus the Shaywitz dyslexia screen. And so if you're familiar with some of these, a cadence is a screening and progress monitoring assessment that actually measures early literacy skills. So can kids break apart words? Can they put them back together? Can they decode words? Those early indicators of reading struggle and reading success. Versus the Shaywitz dyslexia screen is actually a self-report measure filled out by the classroom teacher, which it says, this is directly from their manual, the person who has worked most closely with the student and knows the student best, rate statements about the student. So no actual direct assessment, just do we think this kid has behaviors that look like dyslexia? And so they compared, which was more accurate in identifying the kids who actually had dyslexia. And if you look at the numbers, DIBELS, a Cadence Next, identified 90% of kids with dyslexia. So not perfect, nothing is, but 90% is pretty good. We're getting 9 out of 10 kids. The Shaywitz dyslexia screen, which was a self-report measure, 35%. And to me, that's a huge red flag. 1 out of 3 kids were identified correctly. That means 2 out of 3 kids with dyslexia were not identified. And those of us that know, about dyslexia, if you don't intervene early, that's super problematic. Kids are going to get real far behind. So we want to be able to identify kids early, and data is going to be the best way to do that. The other one I like to share is this study. So this was a study done by some researchers looking at, who we more likely to refer for testing or for special education. And so just some background, we know that about 73 to 90% of students that are referred are typically found eligible for special education. It's that confirmation bias, right? If our team thinks a kid has a disability, typically if we refer them, we're gonna find a way to fit them in. So knowing that, who gets referred then, the question is. And so what this team did was they wrote up these 3 one-page vignettes, samples, not real kids, but vignettes of make-believe kids. One of them looked like they might have a learning disability. One of them looked like they might be talented and gifted. And one of them looked like they might have a behavior disorder. And so wasn't a whole lot of data in these vignettes. There's just kind of stories about, well, this kid, struggles with these things, he's good at these things. And but they're just general vignettes. And so they gave to teachers and asked teachers, how likely are you to refer this sample kid for testing? But the curveball that they threw was each vignette had 3 different versions. And so they wanted the versions to look like, one would look like a white student, one would look like a Latino student, and one would look like a Black student. And so they knew from previous research that the only thing they had to change to get teachers to think that one was white, Black, or Latino was the name of the student. Because based on previous research, we're biased. Even when we hear a name, we think of a race that goes along with that name. And so they changed the name. And so they had, one was Jacob was the supposed white student, Demetrius was the supposed Black student, and Carlos was the supposed Latino student. And so these were the exact same kids, the exact same stories, everything was exactly the same except for the name. So if we have no biases, these kids should have been referred at the same rate, right? The exact same rate. But you can probably guess that's not what they found. What they found was the student that sounded white was much more likely to be referred for learning disability than a student of color. The students of color were much more likely referred for a behavior disorder than a white student, which is very problematic given what we know about students with those labels or those disabilities, is they're more likely to be put in a more restrictive setting. So teachers are more willing to do that with a student of color. And for talented and gifted, we're more likely to refer white students. So again, same kids, like these should not be that different if we don't have biases, but we do. And this is hugely problematic. This is why we need to use data to drive what we're doing to help mitigate some of these biases. So yeah, wow. Yeah, I mean, yeah, when I saw that, that's just eye-opening and shocking. But to be honest, not surprising, unfortunately. So with this work, we want to do this in partnership with our families and communities. We don't, we like to say we're not doing this, we're building this with, not for our families and students. They should have input. So we're talking about what are our expectations around PBIS. Students and families should have input on that. Students and families should know what our reading curriculum is and know how that's taught. We want to make sure that they have input on some of the literature that we're using in our classroom. So that should be, with, not for our students. We also want to make sure that we're doing it so families and communities have confidence in what we're doing. They understand, this is our program. When we say Tier 1 reading support, families should know what that is. They should be able to clearly say, well, this is what my student is getting in Tier 1. And also our communities and families are partners in this work. They have a lot of things that they can bring to the table that can help amplify the success of our students. And sometimes when we don't involve them, we're really shortchanging our kids. And then we identify resources that can be leveraged. So other people, other time, we often talk about, we hear educators talk about a lot of times, well, this kid's struggling and the family doesn't want to help and they won't do anything at home. There's a lot of families that want to do more at home, but they just don't know what to do. My area, when we talk about reading, a lot of times when we say, well, how can you help my kid read at home, as educators, all we got is, well, did you read with them at home? That's not helpful, because parents are probably reading with them already. Are there other activities that we can use to build kids' skills? Parents are hungry for that. Community's hungry for that. We just need to give it to them. And so as we kind of start wrapping here, none of this works without the right mindset. We talk about a multi-tiered system. We have to operate with a few mindsets in order to make this equitable and inclusive. And so thinking about things like, we have to have this idea that students don't need to be fixed. I talked about this with the problem-solving model. It's not about fixing students. It's our support systems that need to be fixed. The student outcome data is a reflection of our system. If students are not successful, that's an us problem. That's not a them problem. We also have to believe that all students are equally capable of success given the right level of support. This goes back to what Dan said this morning around belief. If we believe we can do it, typically we get it done. If we believe the kids can't learn, typically they're not going to learn. So we have to have equally high expectations for all of our students, regardless of who they are, color of their skin, where they come from, their disability. We need to have high expectations. And then we also recognize that school systems exist within broader and equitable social systems. I think school systems have been placed this weight on their shoulder that we're supposed to cure, systemic racism. We're supposed to cure this inequities in society. And that's a lot. We can't do that on our own. But if we partner with families and communities and build a system that works for everyone, we can really improve equity and education. There is progress to be made. We can't be perfect, but we can be better with what we're doing. So we want to make sure that we're having a mindset of always getting better in what we're doing. All right. So as we wrap here, last couple minutes, if folks want to just put some final thoughts in the chat, how this structure might be beneficial in your work, what you're looking forward to this year, but just some kind of final thoughts for you. So I think Ben's comment there about is important, kids with significant past trauma, and if we're asking them to transition to 6 to 8 different environments with different rules, expectations, that sets them up to fail. I would argue that sets up all kids to fail, not just kids with trauma. Like if I'm going to a place that has 6 to 8 different expectations, the cognitive load in my brain to figure out I act this way here and this way here, that's really difficult. So we want to think about how do we make a consistent system for our kids. Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate this information. We're looking how we pilot this for early childhood program. Karen, I'd also add, if you haven't seen it, maybe I'll try and grab it and pull in the chat before we go. The IES, the Institute for Education Sciences, just came out with a big guide. I think it was just like a couple of weeks ago around evidence-based practices for early learning environments. So what does the research say about what we should be doing for early learning systems? Maybe I'll try and grab that before we go here, put it in the chat.
Before you go, final, there is a, if you go to the next slide there, John. Oh,
Y-
I
yeah,
love
let me
this
just-
quote, but let's skip ahead just 1 second because I don't
Yeah.
want people to miss this. I know people need to leave because we're right at the end of our time. We would love to hear some feedback if this was helpful to you, if there's other information that you would find useful, or you wish we would have included, we'd love to know. So go ahead, you can highlight that with your phone or click that link if that works, and let us know what you thought. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, and I would just say, just as we kind of wrap here, this quote is important because this to me is what MTSS is all about. You know, if we want to make the education system better, we could try to concoct the perfect intervention, the new curriculum, the new model, and hope for the best. Or we could just settle for a pretty good solution equipped with so many feedback loops that can't help but get better over time. To be honest, any plan you're going to make is not going to work as well as you would want it to. That's just the nature of the beast. So rather than think about, we got to get the perfect system, what you got to get is a system that has feedback loops or systems of looking at data and teaming to make it better over time. And thanks, Brian, for putting that feedback in the chat there as well.